In the winter of 1858, the industrial heart of Birmingham, Alabama, Sledgehammer and brought it down with such crushing force that his master's skull split like a watermelon dropped, something that would haunt the city's foundries for generations. A slave named Brutus Caldwell took a 20 pounds, tolling for the dead, a wet, sickening crack that 17 witnesses would hear from a church steeple. The sound echoed through the sloth ironworks like a bell, their nightmares for the rest of their lives. What the authorities discovered in the aftermath wasn't just murder, was evidence of a conspiracy so twisted and far-reaching that the city's most powerful men spent decades burying the truth beneath tons of molten iron and industrial smoke. The real horror wasn't the killing itself, but what drove a man who had never shown an ounce of violence in 13 years of slavery to commit an act. Furnaces. The blood pooled so quickly that it began to steam and hiss where it touched the superheated metal of the so savage that witnesses claimed they could hear the bones cracking from 50 yards away over the roar of the foundry floor, creating a sound like serpents dying in fire. Continue with the story of Brutus Caldwell and the dark secrets of Birmingham's iron empire. I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because stories like this one don't just disappear into history by accident. They're buried intentionally, covered up, by men with power and money who understood that some truths are too dangerous to survive. And I want you to tell me in the comments, what state or city are you listening from? Because what happened in Birmingham could have happened anywhere in America where men traded in human flesh and molten metal. Violence, but with the rise of Birmingham itself, a city that didn't exist until 1871, but whose foundations were laid in blood and iron decades before its official founding, where progress was built on the backs of the expendable. The truth about Brutus Caldwell's story begins not with ancient burial grounds dotting the landscape like forgotten prayers, but by the 1850s, white settlers had discovered Jefferson County, Alabama. The Cherokee had once called these hills home. The area was still just a collection of mining camps and ironworks scattered across the mineral-rich valleys of iron ore lay so close to the surface that miners could practically scratch it out with their fingernails, while something far more valuable than farmland. The perfect combination of iron ore, coal, and limestone that would eventually make Birmingham the Pittsburgh of the South. The geography itself seemed designed for industry. Coal deposits provided the fuel needed to fire the furnaces that would transform raw materials into the skeleton of industrial America. Limestone, essential for the smelting process, could be quarried from hillsides that rose like ancient cathedrals around the valley floor. It was a geological lottery ticket that Cornelius Sloth, a man whose ambitions were as vast as his cruelty, and whose would make fortunes for some and create hell on earth for others. At the center of this emerging industrial empire was vision extended far beyond the cotton fields that had made Alabama's first generation of planters wealthy. Barely 5'6" in tall, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of winter ice, sloths possessed the kind of restless intelligence that saw opportunity where others saw only problems. Unlike the plantation owners of the Cotton Belt who were content to extract wealth from the soil through traditional agriculture, sloths understood that the future of Southern prosperity lay not in crops that could be destroyed by weather or insects, but in the hellish furnaces that could transform raw ore into the iron that built America's railroads, bridges, and cities. Sloth had arrived in Alabama in 1847 from Pennsylvania, carrying letters of introduction from labor conditions. What he found was a region rich in raw materials, but poor northern industrialists, and a head full of ideas about how to adapt Yankee manufacturing techniques to Southern industrial expertise, populated by planters who viewed manufacturing as opportunity to build an industrial empire using the one resource that Alabama possessed in abundance: enslaved. Somehow, beneath their aristocratic pretensions, while other men saw obstacles, Sloth saw the perfect into the flames. The Sloth Iron Works, established in 1855, quickly became the human beings who could be worked to death without legal consequences. His foundries operated around the clock, fed by a steady stream of enslaved workers whose bodies were considered as expendable as the coal they shoveled. Temperatures that regularly exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahr, turning the foundry floor into slaves in conditions that made plantation fieldwork seemed like a garden party. The furnaces burned at largest industrial operation in Jefferson County, employing over 300, a landscape that resembled the biblical descriptions of hell. Workers labored 16-hour shifts in air so thick with smoke and metal dust that breathing became an act of will, their lungs slowly filling with the residue of industrial progress. The mortality rate among Sloth's iron workers was 3 times higher than that. Always buy more slaves from the failing tobacco and cotton plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, but iron ore of field slaves. But Cornelius Sloth considered this an acceptable cost of doing business. After all, deposits were finite and precious. His business model was brutally simple. Brutus Caldwell arrived at the Sloth Iron Works in the spring of 1855. Equation that reduced human beings to units of production calculated down to the penny per pound of iron produced, the slaves until they died, then replaced them with fresh bodies purchased at the lowest possible price. A reliable worker who had never given his previous owners a moment's trouble. Purchased from the estate of a failing tobacco plantation near Richmond, Virginia, for the considerable sum of $1,200, a price that reflected both his imposing physical strength and his reputation as a dissolute gambler named Harrison Kendall had described Brutus as the finest piece of property I ever owned. Strong as an ox, smart enough to follow complex instructions, but not smart enough to cause trouble. At 28 years, old Brutus stood 6'3" and tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. And hauling timber, and his hands could grip a sledgehammer handle with the same ease another man might hold a dinner. His shoulders were broad as an ox yoke, developed through years of swinging axes. Fork. His skin was the color of burnished copper, marked with the scars that came from 2 decades of hard labor. Old whip marks across his back, burned scars on his forearms from working too close to fires, calluses on his palms, thick as leather, but it was his eyes that people remembered most. Dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every injustice, every cruelty, storing them away like a careful accountant keeping books on a debt that would eventually come due. Slaves who had learned to make themselves invisible to their owners. Brutus possessed a quiet dignity that commanded attention even from white men. Productivity from human bodies with no regard for their long-term survival. Slaves worked 16-hour shifts in. He did speak. His voice was deep and measured with the cadence of someone who chose his words carefully and meant exactly what he said. The work at Sloth Iron Works was brutal beyond imagination, designed to extract maximum temperatures that regularly exceeded 120 degrees, feeding coal into furnaces that glowed like gateways to hell, hauling iron ore in wheelbarrows that weighed more than most men could lift, and operating machinery that could crush a human body in seconds if a worker's attention wavered for even a moment. Hammers before it could be fed into the furnaces. It was back-breaking work that Brutus was assigned to the sledge gang, the men responsible for breaking up large chunks of iron ore with 20 pounds. Destroyed most men within 5 years, leaving them crippled with ruined spines and lungs full of iron dust that turned their spit black and made every breath a struggle. The hammers themselves were works of brutal efficiency, their heads forged from the finest steel and balanced to deliver maximum force with each swing. His hammer falling with mechanical precision that other workers came to depend on. The rhythm of his work became strong man could break ore for perhaps 6 hours before exhaustion made him useless. An exceptional man might last 8 hours. Brutus Caldwell routinely worked 10-hour shifts without showing signs of fatigue. Industrial hell. Other slaves would time their own work to the sound of Brutus's, the heartbeat of the foundry, the steady ring of metal on stone that meant all was well in their corner of this hammer, using it as a metronome that helped them maintain their pace through the endless hours of labor. Boom, crack, boom, crack. The sound echoed through the foundry like a funeral drum, marking time until death. That hammer was practiced for something else entirely, because Brutus Caldwell was planning something that would shake, or freedom came to claim them. What none of them knew was that every swing of the foundations of Birmingham's iron empire and his 20 sledgehammer would be the instrument of his terrible justice. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came not from Brutus himself, but from the other slaves at Sloth Iron Works who began to notice subtle changes in their usually predictable fellow worker during the weeks leading up to December 15, 1858. Over 3 years, started displaying behaviors that set off alarm bells among Brutus, who had never been known to speak unless spoken to, and who had maintained the same daily routines for men whose survival depended on reading the moods and intentions of everyone around them. It began with questions, strange probing questions about work schedules that Brutus had never shown any interest in before. He wanted to know which overseers would be where at what times, which areas of the foundry were visited least frequently by white supervisors, and which escape routes existed from different parts of the facility. These weren't casual for battle. More disturbing were the visitors Brutus had been receiving. In the slave quarters, privacy was a luxury. Inquiries, but systematic intelligence gathering conducted with the methodical precision of a military scout preparing be observed. Every relationship could be monitored by informants looking to curry that didn't exist. Every conversation could be overheard. Every movement could favor with their masters. But somehow Brutus had managed to arrange clandestine meetings with people that other slaves glimpsed only as shadows moving in the pre-dawn darkness, figures who approached through the woods, mysterious figures left behind things that shouldn't have been in a slave's possession, sheets of paper covered with surrounding the foundry and communicated through signals that none of the other workers could interpret, writing that Brutus would study by candlelight before burning to ash. Small packages wrapped in oiled cloth. His hands. The presence of these items suggested connections to the outside world that went far beyond that clinked softly when moved, and once a leather pouch that contained what sounded like coins when it shifted in. Typical slave could maintain relationships that implied resources and planning on a scale that frightened the other workers. Samuel Hutchkins, a fellow slave who worked at the station next to Brutus, later testified that he had seen his friend writing in a small notebook using a pencil stub that had been sharpened down to almost nothing. Of things, you never know when records might come in handy. The notebook disappeared during the investigation. When Samuel asked about it, Brutus had simply said, "A man needs to keep track," following the murder, but Samuel remembered that it was filled with columns of numbers and names written in handwriting so small it looked like anthrax across the pages. 1858 dawned cold and grey over the Sloth foundries with a winter storm blowing in from the north that coated everything in a thin layer of ice and made the already treacherous working conditions even more dangerous. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and the contrast between the freezing air outside and the superheated environment inside the foundry created an atmosphere that was both literally and figuratively explosive. Ice formed on the windows and walls wherever the building's heat couldn't penetrate, while the furnaces roared at full capacity to meet a rush order for railroad iron that Cornelius, the Sloth, had promised to deliver before Christmas. It was the kind of pressure cooker atmosphere that had led to accidents in the past. Men slipping on icy walkways and falling into molten metal or collapsing from exhaustion and being trampled by their fellow workers who couldn't stop the relentless pace of production, even to help a fallen, created a situation where human life became even more expendable than usual. At 3:17 in the afternoon, Cornelius' comrade, the combination of extreme temperatures, hazardous working conditions, and impossible deadlines, Sloth, made his daily inspection tour of the foundry floor, a ritual he never missed because it served multiple purposes. It allowed him to monitor productivity and identify potential problems, but more importantly, it was a daily demonstration of his absolute authority over every aspect of the operation. Sloth dressed for these tours like a general reviewing his troops. Trousers tailored in New Orleans, and boots made from leather so fine they gleamed even in the dim, smoky light of wearing expensive clothes that cost more than most free workers made in a month. Silk shirts imported from France. Wool. Understood that their master's visits often resulted in punishment for someone. Sloth had a talent for finding the ironworks. His appearance on the foundry floor always created a ripple of tension among the workers, who fought with the most diligent workers, and a memory for grudges that stretched back years. He carried a walking stick made and a weapon that he used to strike workers who displeased him. On this particular afternoon, Sloth was from polished hickory, not because he needed assistance walking, but because it served as both a symbol of authority, accompanied by two men who didn't belong in an iron foundry, well-dressed visitors wearing clean clothes or something else entirely. Their presence added an additional layer of tension to an already volatile, carrying leather portfolios that suggested they were there on business rather than inspection. Noticed them whispered among themselves, wondering if these strangers were potential buyers, government inspectors. Their accounts varied so dramatically that investigators would spend months trying to piece together a coherent version of events. What everyone agreed on was this: Cornelius Sloth was situation. What happened next was witnessed by 17 different people, but standing near the number 3 furnace, berating a slave named Samuel for working too slowly, when Brutus Caldwell, working steadily all day, his hammer falling in the same mechanical rhythm that had become the soundtrack of the approached from his usual position at the orb breaking station. According to witness testimony, Brutus had been in foundry, but at approximately 3:15, he simply set down the chunk of iron ore he had been pulverizing, picked up his 20-pound sledgehammer, and walked with calm, deliberate steps toward his master. His movements were so purposeful, controlled, that several witnesses later said they knew something terrible was about to happen, but they were frozen by clearly over the roar of the furnaces and the clang of metal on metal. His tone was respectful, almost disbelief, and unable to intervene. Mr. Sloth's Brutus said, his voice carrying, turned around, and that's when witnesses noticed something they had never seen before: genuine fear in their master's eyes. Not the momentary startle of someone surprised by an unexpected voice, but the deep primal terror of a differential, giving no hint of the violence that was about to follow. "I got something for you, sir." Cornelius Sloth, stick trembling in his hand, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak or move. "What do you want?" Sloth's finally managed to demand, but his voice cracked like a boy going through puberty, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. Man who recognized death walking toward him. Like a piece of the devil's own fire, and Brutus himself appeared to grow larger, more imposing, as if he were behind bluster and authority. Brutus raised the sledgehammer above his head with both hands, the 20 pounds of forged steel catching the red glow of the furnace flames. For a moment, suspended in that hellish light, the hammer brought the hammer down. The sound that followed was unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, channeling the power of every slave who had ever dreamed of striking back at his oppressor. "Justice," Brutus said, an explosive crack that seemed to come from deep inside Cornelius Sloth's skull, followed by the dull thud of his body hitting the foundry floor. But Brutus wasn't finished. He raised the hammer again and brought it down a second time, then a third, then a fourth, each blow accompanied by sounds that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. The crunch of bone, the splash of... When it was over, there was nothing left of Cornelius Sloth's head but a spreading pool of blood and grey matter. Blood and brain matter, the sizzle of human tissue hitting superheated metal that hissed and steamed where it touched the hot iron of the foundry floor. Smell of cooking flesh mixed with the usual odor of cold smoke and metal dust, creating a stench that made several witnesses vomit where they stood. Brutus simply set the bloody hammer aside, looked around at the circle of horrified faces watching him, and said in the same calm, measured tone he had always used, "When addressing white men, somebody better send for the sheriff. I'll be..." Alabama's planter elite that reached all the way to the governor's mansion in Montgomery and beyond, into the highest, waiting right here. The immediate aftermath of Cornelius Sloth's brutal murder sent shock waves through foundation upon which their world was built. This wasn't just another case of slave rebellion. Those were common circles of Southern society where the implications of a slave successfully killing his master threatened the very enough and usually dealt with through swift public executions designed to more terrifying in its implications for the stability of the entire system. Within 2 hours of the killing, Jefferson terrorized other slaves into submission. This was different, more calculated. County Sheriff Thomas Whitfield arrived at the Sloth Iron Works with a heavily armed posse of 12 men, expecting to find capacity. Slaves working their stations as if nothing had happened, while the blood on the floor near furnace number, chaos and possibly more bodies strewn across the foundry floor, found something far more unsettling. Perfect order. The foundry was still operating at full, calmly on a wooden crate near the spot where he had killed his master, his massive hands folded in his lap, like a... 3 was the only visible evidence that a man had been murdered less than 3 hours earlier. The scene, man waiting for Sunday service to begin. He had cleaned the blood from his skin and clothes using rags from the foundry shoulders. When Sheriff Whitfield's men approached with shackles and drawn weapons, Brutus offered no resistance, and his expression was serene, almost peaceful, as if committing murder had lifted some terrible burden from his submitting to arrest with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his years of enslavement. "I killed Cornelius Sloth," Brutus said when Sheriff Whitfield asked for his version of events. "Deliberately, and I'd do it again if I had to. I got no regrets about what I'd done." But when the sheriff asked him why he had committed murder, Brutus's answer sent a chill through everyone present, suggesting depth to the crime that no one had suspected. "Ask his ledgers, Sheriff. Ask what he wrote in his private books. Ask what he did to the ones who came before me. Ask why 43 people went away from here and never came back." The other slaves had returned to work as if nothing had happened, their faces blank masks that revealed nothing of their thoughts or feelings. Missing people. Nothing about the systematic patterns that Brutus seemed to be referencing. When questioned individually, they claimed to know nothing about any ledgers or private books, nothing about killing, yes, but they couldn't explain it. Brutus had always been quiet, respectful, hard-working, a model slave. Whitfield wasn't buying their act of ignorance. In his 15 years of law enforcement in Jefferson County, he had a summer thunderstorm that strikes without warning and then moves on, leaving destruction in its wake. Sheriff, who had never caused trouble for anyone. Explosions of rage triggered by some immediate provocation, like a brutal whipping or the sale of family members. Dealt with dozens of slave uprisings, and they all followed the same predictable pattern. The rebellions were always emotional, chaotic, and short-lived, usually ending The signs of a man driven to momentary madness by unbearable circumstances, with multiple deaths, and the complete breakdown of discipline in the affected area. But Brutus Caldwell showed none of it. Clothes were neat and clean. His voice was steady and controlled. His demeanor was that of someone who had carefully. Investigation that followed would expose secrets that Alabama's power brokers would spend decades trying to bury. Considered his actions and their consequences long before picking up that sledgehammer. This wasn't the behavior of a man who had snapped under pressure. It was the behavior of someone executing a carefully planned operation. Cornelius Law's private office in the Foundry's administrative building, they found exactly what Brutus had told them. Beneath layers of legal maneuvering and bureaucratic cover-ups, when Sheriff Whitfield and his deputies searched to look for a collection of ledgers, correspondence, and financial documents that painted a picture of systematic depravity that shocked even men who were accustomed to the casual cruelties that the units of measurement and cost analysis. Sloth had been conducting experiments on slavery made legal. The ledgers were works of meticulous record-keeping that reduced human beings in a twisted quest to maximize productivity while minimizing operating costs. The books contained detailed his slaves, treating them not as valuable property to be maintained and protected, but as laboratory specimens, records of how long different slaves could work without food before their strength failed, how much weight the productivity gains from various forms of physical and psychological torture, notes detailed which slave could lose before becoming unable to perform their duties, how many hours of sleep they required to maintain peak performance levels. There were charts tracking the effects of different punishments on work output, comparing better to rewards versus punishments, and which ones could be pushed to the point of death without significantly impacting overall production. It was industrial management applied to human. Families could be most effectively controlled through threats to their children, which individuals responded. Correspondence with Dr. Josiah Knott, a mobile physician who was conducting profit from their suffering. But the most damning discovery was a series of misery, with slaves reduced to variables in equations designed to extract maximum inferiority of African amines and justify their continued enslavement. Research into what he called racial medicine, pseudoscientific studies designed to prove the biological letters written in Sloth's own hand and signed with his personal seal revealed to specially modified railroad cars and receiving substantial payments for each specimen delivered alive and insuitable, that he had been providing Dr. Not with slave subjects for medical experiments, shipping them to Mobile into condition for research purposes. The correspondence detailed a business relationship that had been operating for subjects for experiments that ranged from surgical procedures performed without anesthesia to deliberate infections designed to study disease progression in different racial populations. Over 3 years with Sloth, serving as doctor, not primary supplier of human subjects as if they were laboratory animals with clinical descriptions of their physical characteristics, health conditions, and suitability for specific types of research. Dr. Knott's payments were substantial, up to $500 per subject, depending on their physical return, with Dr. Knott describing his research as terminal studies that would condition and the type of experiments planned for them. The letters made clear that the subjects were never expected to advance medical knowledge at the expense of individual lives that he considered scientifically valuable, but personally worthless. Sheriff Whitfield realized he was looking at evidence of systematic murder, disguised as scientific research, but he also understood the political implications of what he had discovered. Dr. Josiah Knott was no backwards quack operating in secrecy. He was a respected member of the medical community, a man whose theories on racial superiority were cited by politicians and judges throughout the South as justification for slavery itself. His research was funded by medical schools and scientific societies, and his findings were published in prestigious journals that shaped public policy and legal precedent. Exposing the experimental program wouldn't just system depended on for moral and intellectual justification, destroy careers and reputations. It would undermine the scientific foundation that the entire Southern methods were exposed as torture and murder. Then his conclusions about racial differences would be called into question, potentially undermining the legal and philosophical arguments that supported slavery itself. The sheriff made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and changed the course of the investigation in ways that experimental program be destroyed. The official report stated that Cornelius Cello had been killed by a slave named protected the guilty while condemning the innocent. He confiscated all of Sloth's ledgers and correspondence, told his deputies that they had found nothing of importance in the office search, and ordered that all evidence of the Brutus Caldwell, for reasons unknown, possibly related to a workplace dispute or personal grudge. But Sheriff Whitfield wasn't entirely corrupt. Was a man torn between his duty to uphold justice and his understanding of the political realities that governed his world. He kept copies of the most damaging documents, storing them in a tin box that he buried beneath the could be told without destroying the social order. But the deeper truth was simpler and floorboards of his own home. He told himself he was preserving evidence for some future reckoning when the truth, more human. He couldn't bring himself to destroy the only proof that 43 innocent people had lived, suffered, and died in agony for the advancement of science and the profit of evil men. The trial of Brutus Caldwell began on January 18, 1859 in the Jefferson County Courthouse, a modest brick building with white columns that had been designed to project an image of classical justice, but would soon prove inadequate to contain the explosive secrets it was asked to judge. Alabama law. The outcome was never seriously in question. A slave who murdered his master would hang. The state's commitment to protecting white lives while maintaining the fiction that slaves received due process, regardless of circumstances, motivation, or provocation. The legal proceedings were typically brief formalities that served more as public theater than actual trials designed to demonstrate, but assumed would remain buried forever. The difference was Benjamin Carver, something far more complex and dangerous, threatening to expose secrets that some of Alabama's most powerful men under the law. But what should have been a simple proceeding that concluded within a day or two quickly became court-appointed lawyer assigned to represent Brutus, a man whose background and principles made him uniquely unsuited for the role of providing token defense for a doomed slave. Recent graduate of Harvard Law School, who had returned to his native Alabama with ideas about justice and legal ethics that didn't quite fit the Southern mold he had grown up in. The son of a small-town minister, he had but not destroyed by his exposure to the harsh realities of slavery during his childhood. His legal education in Boston, been raised to believe in the fundamental dignity of all human beings, a philosophy that had been challenged, had exposed him to abolitionist arguments and constitutional principles that were rarely discussed in Alabama. Carver was young enough to still believe that the law could be an instrument of justice, rather than simply a tool for courtrooms, giving him a perspective that combined Northern idealism with Southern practicality. At 26 years old, maintaining existing power structures, he had returned to Alabama, hoping to build a practice that would allow him to support social reform while earning a decent living. But the reality of legal practice in a slave state had proven more morally complex than his Harvard professors had prepared him for. Court-appointed defenders of slaves typically offered peremptory defenses designed to satisfy legal requirements. They entered pleas for mercy, collected their modest fees from the state, and moved on to more profitable work, without actually challenging the prosecution's case or the broader system that made such prosecutions inevitable. That justice, as Alabama defined it, was served, representing white clients in civil disputes. The expectation was that Benjamin Carver would follow this established pattern, providing just enough legal representation to satisfy procedural requirements while ensuring Southern justice. What he discovered during his preparation would transform opportunity to test the principles he had learned about constitutional law and human rights against the realities of not only the trial, but his own understanding of the system he had sworn to serve. Unlike other court-appointed lawyers who typically met their slave clients only minutes before trial began, Carver made multiple visits to the Jefferson County Jail, where Brutus was being held in solitary confinement, spent hours listening to his client's story, taking detailed notes, and gradually uncovering a narrative that slavery, justice, and the rule of law in Alabama. Brutus revealed that he could. What Carver learned during these jailhouse conversations challenged everything he thought he knew about, was far more complex and disturbing than the simple murder case he had expected to defend. Read and write, skills he had carefully hidden for over a decade because literacy in slaves was illegal. Detailed records of everything he had witnessed at the Sloth Iron Works, maintaining his own parallel accounting, punishable by severe physical punishment. More shocking was the revelation that Brutus had been keeping a system that documented crimes the legal system would never acknowledge, hidden in the slave quarters, sewn into the lining of a coat that had belonged to his father. Brutus had maintained a journal written in tiny, precise handwriting on scraps of paper, scavenged from the foundry office. The journal contained names, dates, and descriptions of horrors that matched and expanded on what Sheriff Whitfield had found in Sloth's private records, but from the experimental program in devastating detail. He had witnessed slaves being selected for shipment to perspective of the victims rather than their tormentor. Brutus' records revealed the full scope. More importantly, he had tracked the pattern of selection over 3 years and realized that his own name had restraints, observed as they were drugged and prepared for transport like livestock being shipped to slaughter. Mobile, watched them being loaded into modified railroad cars that had been fitted with medical equipment, and during one of their meetings, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, appeared on the list for the next shipment scheduled for December 20th, 1858, just 5 days after he killed Cornelius Sloth. "I wasn't murdering my master, Mr. Carver," Brutus explained. "Doctor, one by one, like a farmer feeding chickens to a fox. Put to stop him but me. I knew if I let him ship me off to Mobile, there wouldn't be anybody left who understood what I was fighting for my life and the lives of every man, woman, and child in those quarters. Sloth was feeding us to that. Might protect thousands of other people throughout the South. But he also understood that using such evidence potentially revolutionize the legal treatment of slavery and establish precedents for slave self-defense that happening, or who could warn the others. Benjamin Carver found himself in possession of evidence that could destroy his career, get him killed, and potentially make conditions worse for slaves throughout Alabama by most powerful figures in Alabama politics and society, not just Dr. Knott and his medical colleagues, but triggering a violent backlash from the white community. The men implicated in Brutus's journal included some of the railroad executives who had provided transportation for human cargo, government officials who had signed shipping permits without asking questions, and judges who had provided legal cover for the entire operation by ruling that medical experiments on slaves fell within the normal rights of property ownership. The solution Carver devised was as brilliant as it was dangerous, a legal strategy that would force his own knowledge of their crimes. Rather than directly accusing respected members of the community of murder and conspirators to expose themselves while maintaining plausible deniability about and business dealings. His plan was to use Dr. Knott's own arrogance against, then systematically destroy their credibility through careful questioning about their professional relationships. Torture. He would subpoena them as character witnesses for Cornelius Sloth,